My name is Maya Chen. I was 36 years old, and according to everyone who shared my last name, I was the greatest mistake my family had ever produced. For 17 years, my mother and stepfather believed I survived on waitressing tips and borrowed goodwill. They never once suspected what I actually did for a living, until my aunt sent me a message that made my blood run cold. 40 minutes later, I was standing on her doorstep beside 2 police officers, and nothing about any of our lives would ever be the same again. Let me tell you how a woman who was supposed to be a failure dismantled a 17-year criminal conspiracy built entirely around her silence. I was a senior investigator with a state financial crimes unit, specializing in asset fraud and the exploitation of vulnerable adults. I had testified in federal hearings, published research under a shortened name, and trained younger investigators who had no idea my own family thought I survived on leftover soup and borrowed dignity. I kept it that way deliberately. My stepfather, Richard Holt, was the kind of man who collected weapons quietly: information, reputation, leverage. If he had known what I did, he would have found a way to weaponize it before I even understood the threat. The message that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday evening in October. My Aunt Gloria, my mother's older sister, the woman who had raised me through every storm my mother's choices created, sent a photograph to my phone. It showed a small ceramic teapot, white with painted lavender flowers, sitting on her windowsill with the spout pointed toward the street. Beneath the photograph were 5 words: "The garden key is missing." Anyone else would have seen a confused elderly woman sending a strange text. I saw an emergency broadcast. When I was 11 years old, Gloria had sat with me in her kitchen after Richard threw away a science ribbon I had won because, he said, intelligence in girls created problems for everyone around them. Gloria had retrieved that ribbon from the recycling bin, wrapped it in a square of green cloth, and placed it inside a ceramic canister shaped like a teapot. She taught me 2 things that afternoon. First, that a teapot spout facing the street meant she could not speak without being heard. Second, that a missing garden key meant something precious had been taken. She had not texted me about gardening. I called the non-emergency line, explained that I had received what I believed was a coded distress signal from a vulnerable adult, and requested a welfare check. I described Gloria's situation carefully without mentioning my own profession. 40 minutes later, I stood on a sidewalk I had not visited in 3 years, beside 2 officers named Carver and Reed, watching the front door of a pale green house open slowly. Richard Holt appeared in the doorway. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, wearing a weekend cardigan, and projecting the calm of a man who expected the world to apologize for interrupting him. Beside him was my mother, Diane, whose smile arrived half a second too late to be genuine. Richard looked at the officers, then at me, and something passed across his face that was not surprise. It was recognition, the kind that comes from a plan you already prepared for. Before either officer introduced themselves, Richard stepped close enough that only I could hear him and said 4 words. "Still playing detective, Maya." My family had supposedly believed for 17 years that I couldn't hold a career together. He should not have known there was a role to reference. I said nothing. I filed that sentence somewhere cold and precise and waited. Richard told Officer Carver that I had a documented history of instability, that I had lost 3 jobs in the past decade, and that family gatherings always ended with me creating scenes that required professional management. He said it with genuine sorrow, the way a kind man reluctantly shares a difficult truth. He had clearly rehearsed it. Officer Reed asked to see Gloria. Richard said she was resting and that her medication sometimes produced confusion that strangers could misinterpret. The officers insisted. Richard yielded with a gracious sigh that suggested he was humoring a misunderstanding. Gloria appeared at the end of the hallway wearing a bathrobe she would never have chosen to greet visitors in. She had always dressed carefully, always worn her silver earrings, always held herself like a woman who understood that presentation was its own form of power. That evening, her left wrist carried a pale yellow bruise partially hidden by her sleeve, and her eyes moved to Richard before they found me. When Officer Carver asked if she felt safe, she said she was fine, but her left hand, hanging at her side where Richard could not see it, was making a small motion I recognized from childhood. 3 fingers tapping against her palm. Our private signal for not in front of him. The officers couldn't remove anyone based on suspicion alone, but they separated Gloria from Richard long enough to ask standard questions. While they spoke, I noticed something on the small table beside the hallway mirror. The green cloth square from her ceramic canister was folded into a triangle and tucked beneath a vase. It was the cloth she had used to wrap my science ribbon 25 years earlier. She was telling me where to look. I didn't touch it. I photographed its position, asked Officer Reed to note that Gloria had directed my attention to it, and waited until Gloria formally handed it to me and Officer Carver witnessed the exchange. Because I was family, every step had to be surgically clean. Inside the cloth was a folded envelope and a small USB drive no larger than my thumbnail. Richard appeared at the end of the hall and ordered me out. Gloria raised her head. "She came at my invitation," she said. "Glor, you're exhausted. Let the officers handle this." "I invited her," she repeated, and took a step toward me instead of away. Officer Carver documented Richard's attempt to redirect her and Gloria's visible movement away from him. On the sidewalk afterward, Richard followed me to my car. Once the officers had moved out of earshot, his cardigan warmth dissolved completely. "You should have stayed buried," he said. "Your supervisor will hear from me." 17 years of being described as unemployed. He should not have known I had a supervisor. I asked which supervisor he meant. He smiled the way people smile when they've been waiting a long time for a specific moment. "Exactly," he said, and walked back inside. I drove directly to my unit's secure processing office, found my supervisor, Diane Okafor, and disclosed the full conflict of interest before I touched anything. She immediately removed me from any investigative role, assigned evidence review to my colleague Marcus Webb, a forensic accountant with 11 years of experience who had sat beside me through dozens of cases and never once asked why my family thought I spent my evenings applying to warehouse jobs. With Diane present, Marcus and I opened the envelope in the cloth square. Inside were 4 items: a small notebook filled in Gloria's handwriting, 3 sealed bank envelopes, a prescription bottle with the pharmacy label scratched off except for one detail. The prescribing physician had been changed 6 weeks earlier without Gloria's request, and my science ribbon, still wrapped around itself, the way she had placed it 25 years ago. The first envelope held withdrawal records totaling over $214,000 across 19 months. The second contained a deed transfer document moving 40% ownership of Gloria's house into a company called Clearwater Legacy Partners. The third held a lasting power of attorney bearing Gloria's signature. The witness listed below the signature line had suffered a fatal stroke 14 months before the document was dated. Clearwater Legacy Partners was registered at a mail forwarding address in a strip mall outside of Newark. Its listed financial director was not Richard Holt. It was me. My full legal name, my date of birth, an electronic signature derived from documents I had filed years earlier, a home address I had used during my second year with the unit. Someone had spent considerable time building a structure designed to make me look like I was robbing my own aunt. The USB drive contained bank records, photographs of documents before they were removed from Gloria's files, 2 audio recordings of Richard pressuring her to sign forms she asked to review first, and a short video Gloria had recorded on her phone while sitting on her bed. She looked directly at the camera and said, "If Maya sees this, I want her to know that Richard has been telling everyone she is trying to take my money. She isn't. He's been preparing that story for years. He keeps saying no one will believe the unemployed one over the successful son-in-law." The video cut off when footsteps sounded outside her bedroom door. Marcus reviewed the records overnight and called me the following morning. "He built the scapegoat before he moved the money," he said. "Every year your family spent calling you irresponsible was a year he spent making sure a jury would believe you had a motive." A line in Gloria's notebook, dated nearly 4 years earlier and underlined 3 times, read, "Richard asked whether Maya's department would protect her if the family found out what she really does." A second entry, 8 months later, noted that he had requested copies of my tax returns under the pretext of preparing a shared family estate plan. He had known for years. He had been collecting pieces to assemble my guilt. Marcus submitted everything through official channels while I signed a formal recusal statement. I could provide family history and testify to what I had personally witnessed, but I could not access restricted databases, direct interviews, or make investigative decisions. Richard understood legal procedure well enough to know exactly what that restriction cost me. 2 days later, he emailed me an invitation titled, "A chance to resolve this privately before it becomes something none of us want." I accepted, because refusing would have let him tell everyone I had avoided a reasonable conversation. Before I went, I gave Marcus the address and time, confirmed I would carry no investigative materials, and activated an emergency contact protocol we normally reserved for interviews with hostile subjects. Richard's financial advisory firm occupied the 14th floor of a building in Midtown with views of the Hudson. His receptionist mentioned he had arranged free counseling for her sister after a difficult divorce. A framed photograph near the elevator showed him presenting a check to a pediatric literacy program. That was the architecture of his safety. He performed enough real generosity that the people most likely to be called as character witnesses always had a personal story that made doubt feel like ingratitude. He welcomed me with coffee I didn't drink and slid a folder across his desk. Inside were photographs, me entering my unit's building, me at a regional conference in Baltimore, me having lunch with Marcus outside a courthouse, me shaking hands with a division chief at an awards ceremony. There were copies of articles I had published, a list of cases in which I had testified, and a printed page from a professional directory bearing my credentials. "You told everyone you did temporary filing work," he said. I asked how long he had been watching me. "Long enough," he said, "to understand that silence is a choice, and you chose it for 17 years. People believe what they hear consistently, especially when the person being discussed never corrects the record." He placed a complaint document on the desk addressed to my unit's internal affairs office. It accused me of using restricted government access to investigate family members for personal gain. Attached were access logs that appeared to show I had searched Gloria's financial accounts more than 8 months before she ever contacted me. The logs were fabricated, but they were sophisticated enough to survive initial review and trigger an immediate suspension. Richard explained what filing the complaint would produce: administrative leave, internal investigation, challenges to prior testimony, reopened hearings for people convicted partly on my evidence. He named 2 specific cases. One involved an elderly veteran whose pension had been systematically drained by a trusted accountant. Richard had identified which victims I cared about most and was prepared to use them as levers. He gave me 48 hours. Confirm that Gloria had misunderstood the documents, withdraw all allegations, and he would describe Clearwater as standard estate planning. Continue, and my career would become the first thing that disappeared. After that, he said, they would need to discuss whether Gloria was truly capable of living independently. I left without touching the folder. That evening, my mother called and asked to meet me at a hotel near Grand Central. She arrived wearing large sunglasses and chose a corner table with sightlines to both exits. Her composure held perfectly until a server appeared too quickly, and then I watched her hands tighten on her coffee cup before she made herself release them. I recognized that instinct. She had spent decades learning to conceal fear the same way Richard had learned to conceal cruelty. I expected her to repeat his arguments. Instead, she placed a small key on the table between us. "It opens the filing cabinet in his private study," she said. "There are records in there that should never have been created." I didn't touch the key. Taking it without legal authority would give Richard grounds to allege burglary and contaminate anything discovered inside, but I listened. My mother, Diane, admitted that she had witnessed documents and signed corporate minutes after Richard told her Clearwater was a legitimate planning vehicle. In the beginning, she said, she hadn't asked questions she should have asked, partly because she was benefiting from the lifestyle, and partly because questioning Richard had always produced consequences she preferred to avoid. Later, when she began looking more carefully, she discovered that Clearwater had borrowed against Gloria's house, paid for personal renovations, and funneled money through consulting accounts connected to Richard's firm. When she confronted him, he showed her documents bearing her own signature and explained that she would face prosecution if she said anything publicly. My mother was not innocent. She had laughed at jokes about my career. She had encouraged Gloria to let Richard manage her finances. She had helped him convince Gloria's friends that family visits were tiring for her. But she had also discovered that in Richard's accounting, she was as disposable as everyone else. She told me he planned to move the remaining funds within 48 hours and force Gloria to sign a revised trust document, a new medical authorization, and a written statement accusing me of coercion. He had arranged for a private physician to evaluate Gloria after quietly increasing the dosage of the medication that made her disoriented. She also told me that Richard recorded every significant conversation in his private study and backed those recordings to an external server. Insurance, he had told her, because everyone eventually betrayed you. I told her to give Marcus a formal statement before Richard created one for her. She said she was afraid he would release private messages, destroy her publicly, and leave her holding every charge alone. He'd already prepared materials to do exactly that. I told her that cooperating with him only gave him more time to build a better case against her. Before she left, she mentioned one more thing. Richard had kept a file with my name on it since before I joined the unit. The first page was labeled in his handwriting, contingency. This had never been only about Gloria's savings. Richard had spent 17 years preparing for a confrontation with me, and every public insult, every family dinner where he described my failures with theatrical disappointment had been part of an organized defense strategy. The elder protection specialist assigned to Gloria's case was a woman named Cecilia Marsh. She insisted on meeting with Gloria inside her home while Richard was out, and before we entered, she told me about an elderly man she had worked with years earlier, whose daughter had isolated him, sold his property, and successfully convinced a judge he had dementia. He died before his rights were legally restored. Cecilia wanted me to understand that financial abuse did not pause for perfect legal timing. She sat at Gloria's kitchen table and didn't begin by asking whether money had been stolen. She asked what Gloria was permitted to decide on her own. Could she choose her doctor? Only if Richard approved the referral first. Could she leave the house without telling anyone? Not since Richard had begun claiming she became disoriented outside. Could she access her bank accounts? Richard said financial information caused her unnecessary anxiety. Could she call friends without supervision? He had removed the landline. Her mobile phone was frequently taken for charging and returned hours later. Could she decline to sign something? Gloria's hands trembled. He says refusing proves I don't understand what I'm signing. Cecilia drew a line down a sheet of paper. On one side, she wrote the word care. On the other, she wrote control. Then she listed what each looked like in practice. Care expanded your choices. Control made choosing feel dangerous. Care explained. Control threatened. Care protected your judgment. Control made your judgment the first thing questioned. Gloria stared at the paper for a long time. Then she told Cecilia that Richard had threatened to arrange memory care placement if she raised questions about withdrawals. He had taken her passport and driver's license for safekeeping. He had intercepted her post and redirected her prescription deliveries. He had told extended family that Gloria was becoming paranoid and that visits were upsetting to her. Whenever she pushed back, he reminded her that Maya was unemployed, financially desperate, and waiting for the house. He also told her I had fabricated evidence in old cases and destroyed innocent people's lives. I knew none of it was true, but Gloria whispered, "He said he had documentation, and I was afraid. If I accused him, who would believe me over him?" Cecilia asked whether Gloria wanted emergency protective measures put in place. I almost answered for her. Cecilia stopped me with a look. Gloria needed the right to choose, even if choosing took time. The room was quiet for nearly 2 minutes. Then Gloria stood, walked to her bookshelf, and removed a worn cookbook from the bottom shelf. Inside the back cover, tucked beneath a laminated recipe card, was a notarized revocation of Richard's power of attorney signed 11 months earlier. She'd attempted to deliver it to her bank. Richard found out, told the branch manager the document had been signed under pressure from a manipulative family member, and persuaded them to reject it while Gloria was made to sign a replacement. She had kept the original copy in the cookbook and told no one. "I kept this because I wanted proof," she said, "that there was at least one day when I said no." She also revealed something else. Several entries in her notebook contained deliberately incorrect figures. Richard periodically searched her room, and the false numbers helped her track which pages he had read when he later repeated the wrong details back to her as evidence of her confusion. Gloria had not been passive. She had been conducting her own quiet investigation, waiting for someone who would know how to read the signals she was leaving. Cecilia contacted an elder law attorney named Priscilla Odom, who prepared an emergency court petition freezing all disputed assets, suspending Richard's authority over Gloria's finances and medical decisions, preventing him from altering her housing arrangements, and blocking unauthorized changes to her prescriptions or medical records. Marcus and the financial crimes detectives used my mother's formal statement to obtain preservation orders covering Clearwater's accounts, Richard's office files, the private physician's communications, and the external recording server. Richard sensed movement immediately and began calling extended family. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade sent messages claiming Gloria had privately confided her concerns about my finances. An uncle forwarded a photograph Richard had somehow produced, suggesting Gloria had been paying my rent. Another relative wrote that Gloria had always worried Richard needed to protect her from my desperation. Gloria listened as I read several messages aloud. Then she held out her hand, took my phone, and began blocking the numbers herself. "I spent too many years protecting the peace of people who never once protected me," she said. "I don't want that peace anymore, not if it means helping him lie." Then she called her oldest friend, a woman she hadn't spoken to freely in over 2 years, and told her the truth without asking Richard's permission first. Her voice shook during the entire conversation. She didn't stop. The emergency order was granted the following morning. Richard lost access to Gloria's accounts. He was prohibited from entering her property without prior arrangement. Independent oversight was required for any medical evaluation. Clearwater's assets were frozen pending investigation. For the first time in years, he had lost control of the money, the house, and the medical story. So he filed the complaint. The Inspector General received a package accusing me of unauthorized database searches, identity theft, evidence tampering, and exploiting a vulnerable relative for financial gain. A legal commentary blog published an article describing, in enough specific detail for my colleagues to recognize me without naming me directly, an unnamed government investigator who had allegedly used her professional position to construct a shell company for elder fraud. Within 3 hours, the article had been republished by 6 smaller outlets. By noon, I had surrendered my credentials, laptop, case access, and building card pending review. A promotion I had been working toward for 2 years was placed on hold. An attorney connected to one of my earlier cases filed a motion requesting my full disciplinary history. 2 defense teams in separate criminal matters filed applications challenging whether I had compromised evidence in unrelated investigations. My landlord received a letter suggesting federal agents might need access to my building. Anonymous messages reached 3 of my neighbors claiming I had a history of targeting elderly people. For several hours, I considered giving Richard what he wanted, not because I believed him, but because people who had trusted my testimony in real cases might now face additional hearings. Victims who had already survived one ordeal might be forced into another. Gloria heard the hesitation in my voice over the phone. "He hurt your work, didn't he?" she said. It wasn't a question. I told her yes. "Then stop for me." I told her I couldn't. "If I stop now," I said, "he decides what my career meant. He gets to say I helped strangers so I could appear trustworthy while I robbed you. Every person I ever helped becomes part of his story about me." Gloria was quiet. Then she said, "Then we finish this, but we finish it together." Marcus discovered the error in the forged access logs the following week. They referenced a server architecture my unit had retired nearly 3 years before the alleged searches were supposed to have taken place. The files also contained hidden metadata connecting them to Richard's firm. One document had been created on a desktop registered to his office. Another had been edited using my mother's login credentials after midnight on a date she had airline records proving she had been in Florida. The digital signature attributed to me had been extracted from a joint tax return Richard had prepared and filed on Gloria's behalf years earlier, when he still had legitimate access to her documents. My mother called from a phone she had purchased with cash. Richard had instructed her to sign a statement claiming I had pressured her into providing the filing cabinet key and threatened to expose an extramarital relationship unless she cooperated. She admitted the relationship had occurred during a period when Richard traveled frequently and had been emotionally absent for over a year. He had secretly preserved her messages and photographs against exactly this kind of moment. I told her to give a formal statement before Richard submitted one for her. The following morning, my mother walked into the district attorney's office, accompanied by an attorney she had retained independently, and handed over her phone, her personal email archive, a backup drive she had removed from Richard's home office safe, and a handwritten account of every document she had signed, every conversation she had witnessed, and every instruction she had received and followed. She admitted signing false corporate records. She admitted encouraging Gloria to trust Richard's financial management. She admitted repeating fabricated stories about my career to relatives. She admitted allowing Richard to use her professional credentials and social access. Her cooperation did not erase any of it, but it destroyed the unified front he had spent years constructing. Priscilla arranged for Gloria to move temporarily into a secure residential suite while the legal proceedings progressed. Richard responded by canceling her insurance payments, redirecting her prescription deliveries, contacting her physicians to dispute her legal capacity, and filing an emergency guardianship petition, claiming Gloria was being held against her will by me and her attorney. Each action violated or challenged the protective order. Each action created additional documented evidence of his determination to control her regardless of what the court had said. Then the investigators recovered the external recording server. It contained years of conversations. Richard coaching my mother to describe Gloria's memory lapses in medical terminology she hadn't used previously. Richard negotiating backdated signatures with a notary over the phone. Richard directing fund transfers through Clearwater in amounts calculated to remain under reporting thresholds. Richard reviewing the false guardianship petition before it was filed and describing it as a necessary defensive measure. Richard explaining to an accountant in a conversation recorded 2 years before Gloria's distress message ever reached me, the complete architecture of what he had built. The accountant asked why he had used my name for the company. Richard said, "Maya is on paper as the director. Everyone in the family knows she can't manage money and has always needed Gloria's support. She investigates financial fraud for a living, so when she's the one claiming to have found fraud, we say she manufactured the evidence. The narrative writes itself. A second recording revealed he had contracted a private investigator to track my professional life since before I had completed my first year with the unit. Conference programs, publications, courtroom appearances. The investigator had documented which relatives I avoided, how rarely I corrected family misinformation, and how consistently I remained silent when insulted at family gatherings. Richard had never underestimated me. He had studied me carefully and concluded that my silence was a permanent feature he could build around. Priscilla warned that he might still argue Gloria had knowingly approved aggressive estate planning and that some documents bore her genuine signature obtained during periods when he had mixed legitimate forms with fraudulent ones. We needed evidence of active coercion, deliberate deception, and his intent to punish her for exercising independent judgment. Gloria suggested the solution herself. She asked Priscilla to arrange a final family meeting at her house. She would tell Richard she was reconsidering the allegations if he could personally explain the documents, restore control of the trust to her name, and commit in writing to no involuntary care placement. Investigators would be positioned nearby. Gloria formally consented to record the meeting, and Cecilia prepared a medical contingency plan. I objected. Richard had demonstrated he was willing to become physically aggressive when he felt control slipping away. Gloria looked at me steadily. "You have stood in front of me throughout all of this," she said. "This time I want him to see that I can stand in front of you." Richard arrived carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression of controlled magnanimity. Beside him came a private notary and a physician he introduced as a colleague who wanted to ensure Gloria was making decisions with full understanding. He believed the meeting would restore his authority before the court's next scheduled review. Priscilla sat beside Gloria. I remained near the hallway. Cecilia monitored from the adjacent room, and 2 detectives waited in a vehicle outside. Richard laid documents on the table: a replacement power of attorney, a revised trust, a new medical authorization, a written statement accusing me of coercion. He explained that the frozen accounts were preventing him from paying Gloria's care expenses and suggested the court might appoint a stranger to manage her affairs if she refused to act quickly. The physician began asking orientation questions. Priscilla asked him to produce documentation that Gloria had consented to an evaluation. He had none. Richard turned toward me. "Maya has already lost her position. She needs this money. She needs the inheritance." I clarified that I was on administrative leave pending review, not terminated. "Not yet," he said pleasantly. Gloria asked why Clearwater's registration documents listed me as financial director. Richard sighed with the exhaustion of a man explaining something simple to someone who kept forgetting. "You wanted Maya involved, Glor. You've simply forgotten the conversation." Gloria said she had not signed any such registration. He said she had signed more documents in recent years than she remembered, and that this was precisely why professional guidance had become necessary. Every disagreement she raised became a symptom of the condition he was simultaneously constructing and diagnosing. Priscilla asked how much of Gloria's money had entered Richard's firm. He described the withdrawals as management fees. Gloria opened her notebook. $214,000 withdrawn across 19 months, $307,000 borrowed against the house through Clearwater, $72,000 transferred to a consulting account registered to your firm, $38,000 paid to a company your assistant director owns. Is that reasonably accurate? The confidence in his posture shifted slightly. Gloria placed a small brass key on the table and explained that it opened a safety deposit box at a branch he had never accompanied her to. Inside were the original house deed, her prior trust documents, canceled checks he had claimed were never issued, correspondence between Richard and his accountant, and a handwritten list of family members he intended to approach with stories about my financial desperation before Clearwater was ever publicly connected to him. He had searched her home many times. He had never searched a branch account he didn't know existed. Gloria then produced a financial statement showing that $92,000 set aside for my graduate education had been transferred into Richard's firm 14 years earlier. He had later told every relative who would listen that I had abandoned my studies because I lacked discipline and follow-through. Gloria had quietly paid my tuition from her personal savings, told me it was a late scholarship from a community fund, and never mentioned Richard's role in what had been taken. "You stole her future," Gloria said, "and then you mocked her for managing to build one anyway. And when she succeeded regardless, you created a company in her name so you could steal from me and blame her simultaneously." Richard's composure disintegrated into procedure. He told the notary to prepare the documents. He announced the meeting had concluded. He instructed my mother to confirm for the record that everything had been handled transparently. The notary said he could not proceed. The circumstances indicated the signatory was under duress. Richard leaned across the table toward Gloria. "You will sign these documents, or I will arrange a competency evaluation that will result in supervised placement. Maya will face criminal prosecution. Diane will lose everything she has, and you will spend the rest of your life in a facility where I approve every visitor." Gloria reached into the pocket of her cardigan and placed a small digital recorder on the table. "I wanted to make certain the threat was clearly stated," she said. Richard reached for the device. I stepped between them. Gloria picked up the replacement power of attorney and tore it directly down the center. "You spent years convincing me I was too confused to refuse," she said. "Watch me refuse now." She walked to her front door and opened it. Two detectives, Cecilia and a uniformed officer, entered the hallway. Richard announced to the room that his elderly mother was being manipulated by an unstable niece and an ambitious attorney who had manufactured a crisis for professional recognition. One detective informed him that they had recovered his recording server, reviewed Clearwater's transfer records, examined the forged access logs submitted to my unit's internal affairs office, and obtained communications between Richard and the physician containing instructions to document cognitive impairment before conducting any clinical examination. Richard looked at my mother and told her to explain that she had come voluntarily and that nothing at the meeting had been coercive. My mother stepped beside Priscilla. "He threatened all of us separately," she said. "He believed that meant none of us would move at the same time." Richard turned to me. His voice lost the warmth entirely. "I built every story this family told about you. They believed me because you never once contradicted me. 17 years of silence. I assumed it would last forever." I said, "I stayed silent because I believed it kept me safe. You read my silence as surrender. It wasn't." The detectives placed Richard under arrest for violation of the protective order, coercion of a vulnerable adult, witness intimidation, and obstruction of a financial investigation. As they walked him toward the door, he looked back at Gloria. "You are choosing her over your own family." Gloria met his eyes without flinching. "I am choosing the truth over the person I kept finding excuses for." After the door closed, Gloria stood in her own hallway for a long moment and looked at the torn document on her table. "I thought I would feel like I had lost something important," she said. I asked what she felt instead. "Like I stopped shrinking," she said. "Grief, yes, but underneath it, the kind of relief that only comes when you finally stop making yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable." The full investigation identified 6 shell companies, forged authorizations across multiple financial institutions, backdated medical documentation, and over $860,000 taken or borrowed against Gloria's assets over 11 years. Investigators also uncovered funds diverted from elderly clients at Richard's firm, who had trusted him with retirement savings and care funds. Several had been quietly isolated from their children after Richard described those children as having financial motives. Clearwater had been the centerpiece of the scheme because it was built around a scapegoat he had spent 17 years preparing. A grand jury returned indictments on charges of elder exploitation, forgery, identity theft, conspiracy, obstruction, witness intimidation, and fraud. Richard's advisory license was suspended. His firm was placed into receivership. Client assets were frozen for restitution review. Within 4 months, the office had been emptied, its contents cataloged and auctioned, and his personal properties seized. Former employees provided internal communications showing how he had managed audits and attributed financial irregularities to junior staff members who had trusted him enough not to document his instructions. My mother admitted her full role, surrendered funds received through Clearwater, and filed for divorce. In exchange for her cooperation and evidence, prosecutors recommended a reduced sentence. I did not forgive her because she cooperated. Fear explained many of her choices. It did not make them someone else's choices. My internal affairs review lasted nearly 5 months. Specialists confirmed that the access logs were fabricated and that the digital signature had been derived from tax documents Richard controlled. I was fully cleared and reinstated. The promotion was awarded to someone who had not spent 5 months under investigation. Prior cases required secondary review, and my name remained attached to the allegations in search results. Some colleagues apologized privately. Others maintained distance because acknowledging that they had believed Richard's campaign against me meant confronting how easily institutional trust could be weaponized against someone it was supposed to protect. For weeks after reinstatement, I checked the street before I left my building and woke at unusual sounds, convinced I could hear him outside. The truth had not prevented the damage. It had only made the damage worth having survived. Gloria returned to her home after new locks were fitted, accounts were restructured under her sole authority, and a monitored security system was installed. She reconnected with friends she hadn't seen freely in years, joined a peer support group for survivors of financial abuse, and began speaking publicly to families about recognizing coercive control before it becomes invisible. Some afternoons, she still caught herself making excuses for Richard out of the habit of decades. Other afternoons, she blamed herself for not recognizing the pattern sooner. Priscilla reminded her every time that manipulation works precisely by making the person being controlled feel responsible for the behavior of the person doing the controlling. One afternoon, Gloria asked me to accompany her to the safety deposit branch. We opened the box together with the brass key. Inside, beside the deed and the canceled checks and the correspondence, was a sealed envelope with my name written in Richard's handwriting. Inside was the full report from the private investigator he had retained to monitor my career. Photographs of me entering the unit building during my first week. Conference programs from events I had attended over 14 years. Published articles. A printed announcement of my first commendation. Richard had added margin notes throughout. Watch access level, risk if exposed. Narrative must remain consistent. Do not underestimate. Beside a photograph of me accepting a divisional recognition award, he had written in careful block letters, "She must not know we know." The final page showed the exact date he had begun telling family members I borrowed money from Gloria. It was 8 months before Clearwater was registered, before the shell company, before the forged documents, before any of the formal fraud. That was the last piece I needed to understand. Richard had never believed I was a failure. He had said it because my success made his plan dangerous. Every dinner conversation where he described my inadequacy with theatrical regret, every family gathering where he sighed about my wasted potential, every cousin he briefed about my borrowing and my instability, All of it was infrastructure. He needed the people around him to believe I was desperate before he made me look guilty. His cruelty had not been personal in the way I had always assumed. It had been professional. At sentencing, former clients described what it had meant to lose the savings they had protected for decades, the care funds they had set aside with enormous discipline, the homes they had owned for 30 years. Several described being gradually separated from children they later learned had been trying to reach them. Gloria spoke last. She did not ask for punishment proportional to pain. She asked the court to acknowledge what had been stolen from people who had trusted Richard during the years when they were most exposed. "I believe that holding a family together was love," she said. "I have learned that a family held together by fear isn't a family. It's a hostage situation that everyone agrees to call normal." Richard received a substantial custodial sentence, permanent prohibition from managing another person's financial assets in any capacity, and restitution obligations covering multiple victims. Gloria's house was restored entirely to her name. A significant portion of her money was recovered through frozen accounts and asset liquidation. After the hearing, a deputy escorted Richard past me in the corridor. He stopped. "You destroyed this family," he said. "I documented what you built it on," I replied. He asked whether I thought the family respected me now, after everything. "I don't need them to," I said. His expression changed, because his entire strategy had always depended on my need for their approval. Once that need was no longer available to him, he had nothing left that could reach me. And I think somewhere in the architecture of his very careful plan, he had never fully accounted for the possibility that I might simply stop caring whether they believed him. Months later, Gloria returned my science ribbon. She said she should never have hidden it to begin with. I told her she had protected it. She shook her head. "I was protecting the peace," she said. "But I've learned something about peace. Sometimes peace is only the silence that benefits the cruelest person in the room. Real peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of safety. And for 17 years, I confused them." I eventually helped build a collaborative program connecting financial crime investigators, elder law attorneys, independent physicians, and community support workers trained to recognize coercive control before it becomes legally difficult to untangle. Gloria became its first public speaker. She stood at the front of a room full of professionals and held up a ceramic teapot with a lavender pattern and explained to them that not every victim can make a phone call. Sometimes a request for help looks like a misplaced object, an unusual silence, a prescription changed without explanation, a story that suddenly contains small inconsistencies in dates, a photograph of a teapot sent without any text at all. My family spent 17 years presenting me as their most visible disappointment. In the end, the story they built about me was the first thing investigators understood when they examined what Richard had constructed. The scapegoat required a history, and the history required credible witnesses. And the most credible witnesses were the family members Richard had spent years carefully briefing. He lost his firm, his license, his freedom, his marriage, his reputation, his property, and his control over Gloria. I lost a promotion, several professional relationships, months of stability, and the belief I had quietly held that my family's contempt for me had been, at its root, something accidental. The losses were real. So was everything on the other side of them. If your family has spent years insisting you are their greatest failure, I want you to sit with one question before you accept it. Are they disappointed because you truly failed? Or are they frightened because your success makes their version of you impossible to maintain? My name is Maya Chen. For 17 years, my stepfather told everyone in my family that I had accomplished nothing and needed to be managed. Then my aunt sent me a photograph of a teapot on a windowsill. 40 minutes later, I arrived with 2 officers. By the time the investigation closed, the only person whose life had been revealed as built on failure was his. And the only thing that had ever kept his version of me alive was my silence,